They told me to deal with his dying grandmother. I was completely unprepared for what came next. She had 30 minutes to live, maybe less, and my husband looked at me with cold eyes and said 3 words that still haunt me: just deal with her. What I discovered in that hospital room would destroy my marriage, uncover a 60-year-old secret, and reveal that the frail woman dying in front of me wasn't who anyone thought she was. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand why some family secrets should stay buried. This is a true story, and it's darker than you can imagine. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Rebecca Anderson, and I'm 43 years old. I live in a small town in Connecticut where everyone knows everyone's business and keeping secrets should be impossible. But I learned the hard way that the biggest secrets aren't hidden in dark places or locked away in vaults. They're hidden in plain sight inside the people you share your bed with, inside the families you marry, inside the frail bodies of elderly women everyone assumes are confused and dying. 3 years ago, I thought I had a good life. Not perfect, but good enough. I was married to James Crawford, a man I'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 25. We got married after dating for 2 years, and we'd been together for 16 years when everything came crashing down around me. James worked at an auto body shop when he felt like showing up, which honestly wasn't that often, and I worked as an administrative assistant at a law firm downtown. The pay was decent, and it kept us afloat in our small 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street. We never had kids. We tried for about 5 years, but nothing ever happened, and eventually we just stopped talking about it. Looking back, that should have told me something about the state of our marriage, but I was too busy working overtime and paying bills and keeping our household running to see the warning signs. James came from what looked like a normal middle-class family. His parents, Robert and Patricia, lived about 40 minutes away in a neighboring town, and his older brother Daniel lived in Maine with his wife and 2 kids. And then there was Margaret. Margaret Crawford was James's grandmother on his father's side, and she was 91 years old when this story begins. She lived by herself in a run-down little house about 25 miles from where James and I lived, and for as long as I'd been part of the Crawford family, Margaret had been treated like she didn't exist. Nobody mentioned her name. Nobody went to visit her. At Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving gatherings, it was like she'd never been born. If I ever brought her up, the room would go silent. James would get this cold look in his eyes and say, "She's not worth discussing, Rebecca, just drop it." His mother, Patricia, was even worse. One Easter, I asked why Margaret never joined us for the family meal, and Patricia looked at me like I just suggested inviting Satan himself to the dinner table. She said that woman destroyed this family years ago, and we have nothing to do with her. And if you value your place in this family, you'll never mention her name again. I didn't get it. The handful of times I'd actually met Margaret, she seemed perfectly nice. Quiet, maybe a bit withdrawn, but not someone who deserved to be completely erased from her own family. But I didn't push it. I figured every family has their baggage, their old wounds, their feuds that go back generations, and it wasn't my business to interfere. So I stopped asking questions. I stopped wondering why this 91-year-old woman spent every holiday alone in that sad little house. I stopped thinking about her altogether. That was my first big mistake. My second mistake was trusting my husband completely. It was a Thursday night in early October when everything changed. I remember it clearly because I'd just gotten home from a particularly brutal day at work. One of the senior partners had dumped a massive case file on my desk at 4:30 and told me it needed to be organized by Monday. I'd stayed late trying to make a dent in it and didn't get home until almost 9 at night. James was already in bed even though it was early. He liked to get up at the crack of dawn to go fishing or hunting or whatever hobby he was pretending to be interested in that week. I was heating up some leftover pasta when my cell phone rang. The number on the screen was local, but I didn't recognize it. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something told me to answer. A woman's voice came through, crisp and professional. She said, "Ms. Anderson, this is Nurse Kelly from Hartford General Hospital. I'm calling about Margaret Crawford." My heart jumped into my throat. I put down my fork and said, "Is she all right?" And there was a brief pause before Kelly said, "Ms. Crawford has suffered a severe stroke. She's in critical condition right now." and she's been asking to speak with you specifically." I was completely confused. I said, "Asking for me, are you certain?" And Kelly said, "Yes, ma'am, she's been very insistent about it. She listed you as her emergency contact, and she keeps saying she needs to tell you something urgent before she runs out of time." I glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was 9:15 at night. I said how much time she has, and Kelly's voice dropped lower almost to a whisper. She said, "To be honest, Ms. Anderson, I don't think she'll make it through the night. We're talking hours, maybe less." I told her I'd get there as fast as I could and hung up. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. I couldn't understand why Margaret would list me as her emergency contact. He'd probably spoken maybe a dozen times total in all the years I'd been married to James. We barely knew each other. But she was dying and she wanted to see me, and something in Nurse Kelly's tone told me this was desperately important. I walked into the bedroom where James was sprawled out snoring lightly. I shook his shoulder and said, "James, wake up. Your grandmother is in the hospital. She had a stroke and she's dying." He opened his eyes slowly and stared at me like I'd just told him the sky was green. He said, "What do you want me to do about it?" And I said, "So what, James? She's dying. The hospital just called me and said she wants to see me." He sat up then and his whole face changed. It wasn't worry or sadness, it was pure rage. He said, "Why the hell would she want to see you, Rebecca?" And I said, "I have no idea, but I'm going to the hospital." James grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark and said, "No, you're not. You need to stay out of this." I yanked my arm away and said, "James, she's your grandmother. She's dying. Don't you even care a little bit?" He got out of bed and started packing around the room, and he said, "You have no idea what you're walking into, Rebecca. That woman is toxic. She'll twist everything. She'll lie to you. She'll try to poison you against this entire family." I stared at my husband and I felt like I was looking at a stranger. There was something in his eyes, something dark and frightened, and I said, "What did she do, James? What could she possibly have done to make all of you hate her this much?" He wouldn't answer me. Instead, he grabbed his phone off the nightstand and called his father. At 9:30 at night. I stood there listening as James told Robert that the hospital had called and Margaret was dying and that I wanted to go see her. I could hear Robert's voice through the phone, loud and furious, even though I couldn't make out the actual words. James hung up and said, "My parents are coming over right now. We need to discuss this as a family." I said, "Discuss what, James? She's dying," and she asked me where I'm going. He stepped in front of the bedroom door blocking my way and said, "You're not going anywhere until my parents get here." 15 minutes later, Robert and Patricia were sitting in our living room. Patricia's face was blotchy like she'd been crying, but her expression was hard as stone. Robert looked at me, and his voice was cold and flat when he said, "Rebecca, I'm going to say this once, and I need you to listen very carefully. You are not going to that hospital. You are not going to see Margaret. You are not going to involve yourself in this situation. Do I make myself clear?" I said, "No, actually. You don't make yourself clear. She's a dying woman who asked to see me. Why on earth would I refuse?" Patricia leaned forward and practically hissed at me because she's a liar, Rebecca. She's a manipulative, evil woman who tore this family apart decades ago, and if you go to that hospital, she will fill your head with her poison, and we absolutely will not allow that to happen. I looked at James hopping. He would tell his parents they were being completely unreasonable hopping. He would stand up for me, but he just stood there with his arms crossed staring at the carpet. I said, "I'm going," and Robert stood up so fast his chair almost tipped over. He pointed his finger right in my face and said, "If you walk out that door, Rebecca, if you choose that woman over this family, then you can pack your bags and don't bother coming back here." The room went completely silent. I looked at the three of them, my husband, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and I realized they were dead serious. They were giving me an ultimatum, them or her, my marriage or whatever truth Margaret wanted to tell me. I picked up my purse and my car keys, and I walked toward the front door. Patricia screamed after me, calling me selfish, calling me a traitor, saying I was destroying my marriage over a woman I barely knew. James didn't say a single word. He just watched me walk out. I got in my car and started driving. The hospital was about 90 minutes away, and it had started raining, a cold October rain that made the roads slick and dangerous. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts from James and his parents, but I silenced it and kept driving. I didn't know what I was driving toward, but I knew I couldn't live with myself if I ignored a dying woman's final request. Something about the desperation in Nurse Kelly's voice, Something about the way the Crawford family had reacted told me this was much bigger than some old family argument. This was something important, something dark. I got to Hartford General a little before 11 that night. The hospital was quiet and sterile with that particular smell. Hospitals have disinfectant and floor wax and something faintly sweet underneath. Nurse Kelly was waiting for me at the main desk on the 3rd floor. She looked to be in her early 30s with tired eyes and a kind smile. She said, "Thank you so much for coming, Ms. Anderson. Margaret has been asking for you every 10 minutes or so. I honestly think she's been holding on just to see you." I followed Kelly down a long hallway lined with closed doors and dimmed lights. We stopped outside room 314, and Kelly put her hand on my shoulder. She said, "I don't know what's happening with your family, Ms. Anderson, but I can tell you that the woman in there is absolutely terrified. She keeps saying over and over that they're going to destroy the evidence and that you're the only person she can trust." I said, "What evidence is she talking about?" And Kelly shook her head and said, "I honestly don't know, but whatever it is, she believes it's life or death." Kelly opened the door and I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, that sickly sweet combination of antiseptic and something else, something like flowers rotting in stagnant water. Margaret was lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to what seemed like a dozen different machines that beeped and hissed and monitored every struggling function of her failing body. She looked impossibly small. I'd seen her maybe 4 or 5 times over the years, and she'd always been a tiny woman, but now she looked like a skeleton draped in loose skin. Her hair was pure white and so thin I could see her scalp. Her skin had a grayish tint to it. Her breathing was shallow and labored. For a moment I thought I was too late, but then her eyes opened. They weren't cloudy or confused. They were sharp and clear and blazing with intensity. She looked directly at me and her lips moved, forming my name, Rebecca. I walked over to the bed and took her hand. Her skin was ice-cold and papery thin. I said, "I'm here, Margaret." I came as fast as I could. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength and whispered, thank you for coming. I knew you would come. I knew you were different from the rest of them." Her voice was rough and wet like something scraping over broken glass, but every word was perfectly clear. She said to Rebecca, "I don't have much time left, and I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about the Crawford family." I leaned in closer so I could hear her better, and I said, "What is it, Margaret? What do you need to tell me?" She took a shaky, rattling breath and said, "I killed someone, Rebecca. I killed a man named William Porter in 1962, and the Crawford family has known about it for over 60 years, and they helped me cover it up, and if you don't find the evidence before they destroy it, the truth will die with me tonight." I felt the entire room tilt sideways. My vision blurred for a second. I said, "What are you talking about, Margaret? Who is William Porter?" Tears started streaming down her wrinkled face, and she said he was my fiancé. We were engaged to be married, and he was going to kill me, Rebecca. He beat me, he choked me. He told me if I ever tried to leave him, he would murder me, and one night I fought back, and I stabbed him, and he died, and Robert was there. Robert was only 17 years old, and he helped me hide the body. My mind went completely blank. Robert, James's father. She was telling me that he had helped cover up a murder when he was just a teenager. I said, "Margaret, if this really happened, why didn't you go to the police?" And she looked at me with those burning, desperate eyes and said, "Because it was 1962. Rebecca, I was a woman who killed a man nobody would have believed it was self-defense. They would have sent me to prison for the rest of my life, so Robert. And I made a terrible choice. We buried William, and we buried the truth. And we've been carrying it like a stone around our necks ever since." She was struggling to breathe, now gasping between words. And she said, "The evidence is hidden in my house, Rebecca, in the attic. There's a locked trunk behind the old Christmas decorations. Inside that trunk are letters and photographs. And the jacket William was wearing the night he died, everything you need to prove what happened is in that trunk. But you have to get to it before they do, because the second I die, Robert and Patricia are going to go to my house and burn everything." I said, "Margaret, why are you telling me this? Why not go to the police yourself?" And she gripped both my hands, now her bony fingers digging into my skin. And she said, "Because nobody will believe a dying old woman, Rebecca. They'll say I'm confused or senile. But you're young, you're smart, you'll know what to do with the truth. And Rebecca, you're the only person in that family who isn't already part of the lie." Then her eyes started rolling back in her head, and the machine started screaming. Alarms blaring and nurses rushed into the room, shoving me out of the way. I stood frozen in the hallway, watching through the window as they worked on her, watching as her frail body jerked and convulsed, and then went completely still. Nurse Kelly came out a few minutes later, her face somber, and she put her hand on my arm and said, "I'm so sorry, Ms. Anderson, she's gone." I just stood there staring at the closed door, trying to wrap my mind around what had just happened. I'd driven 90 minutes in the rain to hear a dying woman confess to a 60-year-old murder, and now she was dead, and I was the only living person who knew her secret. I walked out to the parking lot in a complete daze. My phone had about 20 missed calls and dozens of text messages from James and his parents demanding to know where I was, whether Margaret was dead or what she had said to me. I ignored all of them. I got in my car and I didn't drive home. I drove straight to Margaret's house. It was almost 1 a.m. when I pulled up in front of the little house on Birch Lane. The place looked abandoned. The paint was peeling off in long gray strips. The front yard was overgrown with weeds as tall as my knees. There was a faded for sale sign stuck in the ground that looked like it had been there for decades. I remembered Nurse Kelly telling me that Margaret had mentioned where she kept her spare key, under the ceramic frog by the back porch steps. I walked around to the back of the house using my phone as a flashlight. I found the ceramic frog half buried in dead leaves, and sure enough, there was a tarnished brass key underneath it. I unlocked the back door and stepped inside. The house smelled like mildew and dust, and something faintly sweet like dried flowers or old perfume. I fumbled along the wall until I found a light switch. The overhead bulb flickered a few times before coming on and casting a dim yellow glow over the kitchen. Everything in the house looked frozen in time. The kitchen had avocado green appliances from the 1970s. The living room had floral wallpaper and lace doilies on every surface. But what made my skin crawl were the photographs. There were dozens of them covering every wall and surface. Family photos, weddings, birthdays, holiday gatherings. But in every single photograph, the faces had been carefully cut out. Not torn, not scribbled over. Cut out with precision, leaving perfectly round holes where people's faces should have been. It was like walking through a house full of faceless ghosts. I stood there staring at a Christmas photo where 5 people stood around a tree, but all 5 faces were missing, just empty circles, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I found the door to the attic in the upstairs hallway. It was a pull-down ladder type, and it took me a few tries to get it open. When I finally pulled it down, a cloud of dust fell on my head, making me cough. I climbed up the creaky ladder into the attic, shining my phone light around. The attic was packed with boxes and old furniture and stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with string. In the far corner, behind a pile of cardboard boxes labeled Christmas decorations, I saw it. An old steamer trunk covered in dust and spider webs. I pulled the boxes out of the way and dragged the trunk into the open. It was locked with an old-fashioned padlock. I tried pulling on it, but it wouldn't budge. I went back downstairs and searched through the kitchen drawers until I found a screwdriver and a hammer. It took me about 15 minutes of prying and hitting, but I finally broke the lock off. I opened the trunk. The hinges creaked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Inside was exactly what Margaret had promised. Letters. Dozens and dozens of letters. Most of them were handwritten on thin paper that had yellowed with age. They were dated from 1961 and 1962. Many of them were between Margaret and someone who signed their name as Dottie. The letters talked about William, about how controlling he was, about the bruises Margaret tried to hide. One letter from Dottie, dated July 1962, said, "Maggie, you have to leave him before he kills you. I'm begging you, please come stay with me. You can't keep living like this." Then there was a gap. No letters for almost a month. And then a letter from Dottie dated August 23, 1962. The tone was completely different. Colder, more practical. Dottie wrote, "I understand what happened and I don't blame you for 1 second, but you need to be very careful. Robert is just a boy and he's terrified. You need to make absolutely sure he keeps his mouth shut and make sure he understands what will happen if he talks." Robert, James's father, he'd been 17 years old, just a kid. And according to these letters, he'd helped his mother dispose of a body. There were more letters giving instructions on what to say to the police. How to act shocked and confused when they came asking questions about William. How to make it seem like William had simply run off, maybe with another woman, maybe to avoid gambling debts. and apparently the plan had worked perfectly. The case had gone cold. William Porter had become just another missing person, just another unsolved mystery. And Margaret had gone on with her life. She'd married someone else a few years later. I had children, lived what looked from the outside like a perfectly normal life, but she'd kept this trunk. She'd kept every piece of evidence. Why would someone do that unless deep down they wanted the truth to eventually come out? I kept digging through the trunk. There were photographs, old Polaroids with that washed-out quality that photos from the 60s have. One showed a young Margaret probably in her early 20s standing next to a dark-colored sedan. The trunk of the car was open, and inside, wrapped in what looked like a canvas tarp, was an unmistakable shape, a human body. There were more photos of a wooded area that I didn't recognize, photos taken at night with a flashlight. You could see two people, a woman and a much smaller figure, probably a teenage boy, dragging something heavy between the trees. My stomach turned looking at them. But the worst thing in the trunk was at the very bottom underneath all the letters and photos. A piece of clothing. A men's jacket. It was made of brown leather, or it had been brown once. Now it was stiff and discolored with dark stains that I knew had to be blood. The jacket was folded carefully and sealed inside a large plastic bag like evidence. On the inside collar, someone had written in faded ink the initials W.P. William Porter. There were slash marks in the leather near the chest. Deep, jagged cuts like they'd been made with a large knife. I sat on the dusty attic floor holding that jacket in my shaking hands, and I started to cry. Not because I felt sorry for Margaret. Not because I was scared, although I was definitely scared. But because I suddenly understood the weight of what I was holding. This was proof. Real tangible proof of a murder that had happened over 60 years ago. Proof that my father-in-law had helped cover it up when he was just a teenager. Proof that my husband's entire family had been living with this secret for decades. And now I had to decide what to do with it. Part of me wanted to put everything back in the trunk and pretend I'd never seen any of it. To go home and try to salvage my marriage. To forget Margaret and William Porter and all of this darkness. But another part of me kept thinking about William Porter. About this man who had vanished in 1962. About whether he had family. About whether anyone out there was still wondering what happened to him. I took the trunk and carried it down from the attic. It was heavy and awkward, and I almost dropped it twice on the narrow stairs, but I managed to get it to my car. The sun was just starting to come up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I drove home, and when I walked through the front door, James was waiting for me. He was sitting on the couch, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. His face was hard and closed off. He said, "Where the hell have you been, Rebecca? I've been calling you all night." I said I was at the hospital when Margaret died. He stood up and said, "Good," and something inside me snapped. I said, "How can you say that, James? How can you be so heartless?" He said, "You don't understand, Rebecca. You don't know what she did. You don't know what kind of person she was." I walked over and put the trunk down on the coffee table between us. I said, "Actually, James, I know exactly what she did because she told me everything before she died." All the color drained out of his face. He stared at the trunk like it was a coiled snake. He said, "What did she tell you?" I said, "She told me about William Porter. She told me about the murder. She told me how your father helped her cover it up when he was 17 years old. And I found all the evidence, James. I found the letters. I found the photographs. I found the jacket with William's blood all over it." James took a step back and his hands were shaking. He said, "Where did you get that trunk?" I said, "From her attic, where she told me it would be." He started packing back and forth, running his hands through his hair, and said, "You had no right, Rebecca. You had no right to go through her things. You had no right to take that." I said, "She asked James. She wanted someone to finally know the truth." He stopped packing and looked at me, and his voice was desperate when he said, "It's not what you think, Rebecca. It was self-defense. William was abusive. He was going to kill her. My dad was just trying to protect his mother. They didn't have a choice." I said, "If it was self-defense, James, then why did they hide the body? Why did they lie to the police for 60 years? Why did they keep all of this hidden?" He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there staring at the floor. Then his phone rang. It was his father. James answered and put it on speaker. Robert's voice came through loud and angry. He said she went to the house, and James said, "Yes, Dad, she has the trunk." There was a long silence on the other end, and then Robert said, "Bring her here immediately. We need to handle this situation right now." Half an hour later, I was sitting in Robert and Patricia's living room. The trunk was on the coffee table like an unexploded bomb. Robert and Patricia sat on one side. James sat next to me, but he wouldn't look at me. Patricia's eyes were red and swollen. Robert's face was like carved stone. Nobody spoke for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Robert cleared his throat and said to Rebecca, "What you have in that trunk is private family business, and you had absolutely no right to take it from Margaret's house." I said, "Private family business? Robert, this is evidence of a murder." Patricia made a choking sound and covered her face with her hands. Robert leaned forward and said, "Let me explain to you what actually happened, because clearly Margaret filled your head with her version of events." He said William Porter was a violent, dangerous man. He beat my mother, he threatened to kill her. He made her life a living hell. And one night, in August of 1962, he came to our house drunk and enraged, and he attacked her, and she had no choice. But to defend herself, she grabbed a kitchen knife, and she stabbed him, and he died right there on our kitchen floor. Robert said I was 17 years old, Rebecca. I was just a kid, and my mother was hysterical. She was covered in blood, and she was terrified, and she begged me to help her, so I did. I helped her wrap William's body, and we drove out to the woods, and we buried him, and we told the police we had no idea where he'd gone. And yes, it was wrong. Yes, we should have called the authorities, but we were scared out of our minds. We didn't think anyone would believe it was self-defense. We thought my mother would go to prison for the rest of her life. He sat back and said, "Yes, we covered it up, and yes, we've lived with that guilt every single day for over 60 years. And yes, it destroyed our relationship with my mother, because every time we looked at her, we were reminded of what we'd done that night." I looked at him and said, "If it was really self-defense, Robert, if it was really just a tragic accident, then why are you all so terrified? Why did you threaten me last night? Why did you tell me I couldn't go see Margaret at the hospital?" Robert's jaw tightened, and he said, "Because we knew she would try to manipulate you, Rebecca. We knew she would twist the story to make herself look like some kind of victim, when the reality is, she made me an accomplice to this. She made me live with this secret my entire life. She ruined everything." Patricia wiped her eyes and said, "Rebecca, you have to understand, we're not bad people. We made a terrible mistake a long time ago, and we've paid for it every single day since, and now that Margaret is finally gone, we just want to move on. We just want to put this behind us forever, and we're asking you to please let us do that." I looked around the room at these three people, my husband and my in-laws, and I realized I didn't know any of them at all. I said, "What exactly do you want me to do?" Robert said, "We want you to give us that trunk. We want you to let us destroy it, and we want you to forget any of this ever happened, and we can all move forward as a family." I said, "And what if I don't?" And the room went completely silent. Robert's face hardened, and his voice went cold when he said, "Then you're choosing to destroy this family. Rebecca, you're choosing to dredge up a 60-year-old tragedy that has absolutely nothing to do with you. And in the process, you will lose your husband, you will lose all of us." James was sitting next to me, and I turned to look at him, and I said, "Is that true, James? If I don't hand over this trunk, if I don't agree to cover this up, are you going to leave me?" He still wouldn't look at me. He stared down at his hands and said, "Rebecca, please just give them the trunk, please just let this go." And at that moment, I understood that he'd already made his choice. His family, their secret, their lie was more important to him than I was, more important than our marriage, more important than the truth. I stood up and picked up the trunk, and I said, "I need some time to think about this." Robert stood up too and said, "There's nothing to think about, Rebecca. This is family business and you need to stay out of it." I said, "No, Robert, this is about a man named William Porter who disappeared 62 years ago, and whose family probably spent decades wondering what happened to him, and you're asking me to help you erase him completely." Patricia spoke up, and her voice was shrill when she said his family moved away years ago. "Rebecca, nobody is looking for William Porter anymore. Nobody even remembers him, and bringing this up now won't change anything. It will only destroy innocent people." I said, "How do you know that, Patricia? How do you know there isn't someone out there still wondering what happened to him, still hopping for answers?" She didn't have a response to that. I looked at James one more time, and I said, "I'm going home now." He said, "I'll come with you," and I said, "No, James, I think I need to be alone right now." I walked out of that house carrying the trunk, and I drove back to my own house, and I spent the next several days reading and rereading everything in that trunk, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me understood their point. It had been 62 years. William was dead. Margaret was dead. Bringing all of this to light now would absolutely destroy the Crawford family, and it would definitely end my marriage. But I couldn't stop thinking about William Porter, so I started doing research. I spent hours online searching for any information I could find about him, and what I found changed everything. William Porter had a younger sister named Helen who was still alive. She was 87 years old, and she lived in a nursing home in Massachusetts, and she had spent the last 62 years searching for her brother. I found newspaper articles she'd given interviews to over the decades. I found posts on missing persons forums from as recently as 6 months ago, where Helen was still asking if anyone had information about what happened to William. She talked about how his disappearance had destroyed her parents, how her mother had died without ever knowing what happened to her son, how Helen herself had never married, never had children because she devoted her entire life to finding out the truth about her brother. And I realized that if I destroyed that trunk, if I helped the Crawford family bury this secret, then I would be taking away Helen's last chance to know what happened to William. I would be choosing the comfort of people who had lied for 60 years over the peace of a woman who had spent her entire life searching for answers. So I made my decision. I made copies of everything in the trunk, every letter, every photograph. I even took detailed photos of the blood-stained jacket. Then I put the originals back in the trunk, and I called the Connecticut State Police. I told them I had information about a 62-year-old missing persons case. 2 detectives came to my house 3 days later. Their names were Detective Martinez and Detective Chen. I gave them the trunk, and I told them everything Margaret had told me on her deathbed. I showed them all the evidence, and I watched their expressions change as they realized what they were looking at. Detective Martinez said, "Mrs. Crawford, do you understand what you're doing here? This is going to open up a major investigation that is going to have serious consequences for your family." I said, "I know, but William Porter's sister deserves to know what happened to her brother." The detectives got a warrant to search Margaret's house, and they found even more evidence. Cleaning supplies from 1962, receipts that matched up with the dates in the letters. And then they got a warrant to search the woods where the old photos had been taken. It took them almost 3 weeks, but they found him. They found William Porter's remains buried exactly where the photographs showed exactly where Margaret and Robert had left him 62 years ago. The medical examiner confirmed that he had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, consistent with the damage to the jacket. The case was officially reopened as a homicide. Robert was arrested and charged with accessory to murder and tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. Patricia was charged as an accessory after the fact because the letters proved she had known about the murder since the 1980s and had actively helped keep it secret. James wasn't charged with anything because there was no evidence he'd known about it before he was an adult. But our marriage was over. He filed for divorce 2 weeks after his father was arrested. He told me I had destroyed his family for no reason. He said his grandmother had been a liar and a manipulator, and I'd fallen for her lies, and I would have to live with the consequences. Robert's lawyers tried to argue self-defense just like he'd told me. They presented Margaret as a battered woman who'd had no choice but to kill William and Robert as a terrified teenager trying to protect his mother. But the prosecution argued that if it had truly been self-defense, they would have called the police. The elaborate cover-up, the disposal of the body, the decades of lies, all of it proved consciousness of guilt. All of it proved they knew what they'd done was wrong. In the end, Robert took a plea deal. He pled guilty to accessory to murder after the fact, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Patricia took a plea deal too and got 5 years probation. The judge said that given their ages and the amount of time that had passed, he was being lenient, but he also said that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that William Porter's family deserved to finally have answers. I attended the sentencing hearing. That's where I saw Helen Porter for the first time. She was 87 years old, and she'd been waiting 62 years for this moment. She gave a victim impact statement, and she cried as she talked about how her brother's disappearance had haunted every single day of her life. She said she didn't care about punishment or revenge. She just wanted to know the truth. She just wanted to be able to bury her brother properly. And now finally, after more than 6 decades, she could. After the hearing, Helen came over to me. She took both my hands in hers, and she said, "Thank you for giving me my brother back. Thank you for not letting them erase him." I started crying because I'd lost everything. My marriage, my home, the life I'd built. But I'd given this elderly woman something she'd been searching for her entire life. The media coverage was intense for a while. A 62-year-old cold case was solved because a dying woman confessed, and her granddaughter-in-law refused to bury the secret. Some people called me a hero. Other people called me a traitor who destroyed a family over something that happened before I was even born. I got angry letters from people saying I should have minded my own business. But I also got letters from families of other missing persons thanking me and saying what I did gave them hope that maybe someday they'd get answers too. James never spoke to me again after the divorce was finalized. Patricia sent me one email calling me evil and saying I had blood on my hands. Robert served 4 years before he was released on parole. As far as I know, the family never forgave me. I moved away from Connecticut. I couldn't stay there with all the whispers and the judgment and the reporters who still occasionally called asking for interviews. I started over in a new state with a new job and a new life. But I think about Margaret all the time. I think about what it must have been like to carry that secret for 60 years, to watch it destroy her relationship with her son and grandchildren, to know she'd taken a life even if it was in self-defense. I think about the letters I found, letters Margaret had written but never sent, where she talked about nightmares, where she saw William's face, where she heard him calling to her from the grave. She wrote that she kept the evidence because someday someone would need to know the truth, that she couldn't take it to her grave because William deserved better than to be forgotten. And I think about William Porter, this man who by all accounts was violent and abusive, but who was also someone's son, someone's brother, who deserved a proper burial, who deserved for people to know what happened to him. The question I've struggled with every single day since this happened is whether I did the right thing. Did William Porter deserve justice, even 62 years later, even though everyone involved was either dead or elderly, even though bringing the truth to light destroyed a family that had been living with guilt for decades? Or should I have let it go? Should I have honored the Crawford family's wishes and destroyed the evidence and let William stay buried in those woods forgotten? I don't have a good answer. I don't think there is a good answer because this isn't a situation with a clear right and wrong. It's messy and complicated and painful, and there are no winners. What I do know is that secrets have a cost. And the cost of keeping William Porter's death a secret was 60 years of guilt and fear and broken relationships, and a family that imploded the moment the truth came out. Margaret's decision to kill William, whether it was truly self-defense or something more complicated, set off a chain reaction that poisoned 3 generations of her family. Robert spent his entire adult life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day when someone would find out what he'd done when he was 17. Patricia lived knowing her husband was involved in covering up a murder, and she chose to protect him instead of telling the truth. And James grew up in a family built on lies, even if he didn't know the specifics until later, and that foundation of deception shaped who he became. I also think about what it means to be loyal to family versus being loyal to the truth, and where the line is between protecting the people you love and being complicit in something wrong. The Crawford family asked me to choose them over a stranger, over a man who'd been dead for 60 years, and they genuinely believed that was the right thing to do. They believed family comes first, always, no matter what. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't look at Helen Porter's face in those newspaper articles. I couldn't read about her decades of searching and tell myself that her pain didn't matter, that her need for closure was less important than protecting people who had lied for 6 decades. There's a part of me that wonders if Margaret manipulated me, if she knew exactly what she was doing when she called me to her deathbed instead of calling her own family. Maybe she knew that I was an outsider, that I didn't have the same loyalty and history that would make me want to protect the secret. Maybe she knew I would be the one person who would actually follow through and find the evidence and bring it to light. Or maybe she just wanted someone to know the truth before she died, someone who would listen without judgment, someone who would understand that she'd been trapped between a terrible choice and an even worse cover-up. I'll never know what really happened that night in 1962, whether Margaret was truly defending herself or whether there was more to the story than what the letters showed. I'll never know if William Porter was really the monster everyone described, or if that was just the narrative that made it easier to justify what happened to him. All I know is what I found in that attic and what I chose to do with it, and I have to live with the consequences of that choice, just like Margaret lived with the consequences of hers for 60 years. The last thing I want to say is this. If you're watching this and you're sitting on a secret, if you know something about a missing person or an unsolved crime or something that happened years ago that nobody talks about anymore, you have to decide for yourself whether speaking up is worth the cost, because there is always a cost. Telling the truth destroyed my marriage. It destroyed my relationship with my husband's family. It completely upended my life. But keeping the secret would have destroyed me in a different way. It would have made me complicit. It would have meant that every time I saw James or his parents, I would have known what they'd done, and I would have had to pretend I didn't. So I can't tell you what the right answer is. I can only tell you what I did and why I did it and hope that maybe it helps someone else who's facing a similar impossible choice. Thank you for watching, and if you made it this far, please leave a comment and let me know what you think. Would you have done what I did, or would you have destroyed the evidence and protected the family? There's no wrong answer. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this because 3 years later, I'm still not entirely sure I made the right choice. But I know I made the only choice I could live with. And sometimes that's all any of us can do.